A young teacher, fresh off an award for her dedication to inner-city students, walks into a community meeting ready to share her vision for the future. But when she steps onto the stage, everything changes. A disgruntled parent, fueled by prejudice, accuses her of pushing an agenda, humiliating her in front of the entire room. Just 10 minutes later, she's escorted out by security, labeled as a problem in her own school district. What happened next left everyone speechless and sparked a series of events no one could have imagined. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from and whether this resonates with your own experiences. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire. It all started on what seemed like a normal day. The street where the Carter family lived was like so many others in the heart of the South. Red clay sidewalks framed modest houses, their porches sagging slightly with the weight of years and stories untold. Neighbors greeted one another with polite nods, but there was always a distance, an unspoken rule that kept certain doors firmly shut and certain eyes from meeting. It was a quiet existence, but one that hid a simmering tension. On a humid July evening, 12-year-old Isaiah Carter crouched in the front yard, sketching a robin perched on the low-hanging branch of a magnolia tree. His father, Thomas, sat on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips, watching the world with a quiet intensity that Isaiah had grown used to but never understood. His mother, Ruth, hummed softly in the kitchen as the aroma of cornbread drifted through the open windows. The sound of tires crunching gravel snapped Isaiah out of his focus. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. The car wasn't unusual in their neighborhood, but tonight its headlights lingered too long on the Carter home. Isaiah froze, pencil midair, as the cruiser came to a stop. Two officers stepped out, their faces shadowed by the street lamp's flickering light. "Evening," one of them said, his voice sharp and clipped. "We've had some reports about a suspicious individual fitting your description," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Thomas. Thomas didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he stood and stubbed out his cigarette. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice even, calm. "What's this about?" The officers exchanged a glance before the second one, younger and clearly less comfortable, spoke. "We're just following up on a call. Mind stepping over here for a moment?" Isaiah's heart pounded as his father walked down the steps, his broad shoulders straight but his hands noticeably empty, deliberately open at his sides. Ruth appeared in the doorway, her humming replaced with silence as she wiped her hands on her apron. "What kind of call?" Thomas asked, standing now in the cone of yellow light. His voice was steady, but Isaiah caught the tightness in it, the careful edge of a man balancing on a thin wire. "Nothing to worry about if you've got nothing to hide," the older officer said, his hand resting on his holster. Isaiah's stomach churned as the words hung in the air. He'd heard them before, whispered in the stories his uncle told when he thought the kids weren't listening. Stories that always ended in bruises, broken dignity, and silence. Ruth stepped out onto the porch. "Is there something we can help you with, officers?" she asked, her voice firm but respectful. The older officer's eyes flicked toward her, his lip curling slightly before he returned his focus to Thomas. "Just need to ask your husband a few questions." "Ma'am." Routine. Isaiah couldn't take it anymore. "My dad didn't do anything," he blurted, his voice shaking as he stood, fists clenched. "He's been sitting right here all evening." Quote, "Isaiah," Ruth snapped, cutting him off. Her tone was sharp, but her eyes were pleading. "Don't make it worse," they seemed to say. The older officer stepped closer to Thomas, who hadn't moved, his expression unreadable. "It's all right, son," Thomas said quietly, his gaze steady on Isaiah. "Go inside." Isaiah hesitated, but Ruth's hand on his shoulder guided him back toward the house. As he stepped through the door, he turned just in time to see the older officer lean in closer to his father, his words low and menacing. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand twitching at his side. The encounter ended as quickly as it began. The officers returned to their car without another word, leaving behind a tense silence that clung to the air like the humidity. Thomas climbed the steps back to the porch, his face unreadable as he sat down and lit another cigarette. Ruth lingered in the doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron. "Everything's fine, son," Thomas said after a long moment, his voice calm but distant. "Go finish your drawing, But everything wasn't fine, and Isaiah knew it. The robin on his page was still unfinished. Its wings mid-flight. The pencil felt heavy in his hand as he stared at the sketch. The image blurred by the tears he refused to let fall. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. But for Isaiah, it was the first time he truly understood the weight of what his parents carried every day. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the way the officers had looked at his father. The way their words had dripped with suspicion. And the way his mother had held herself so still, as if bracing for impact. And for the first time, Isaiah realized that the world wasn't as simple as the stories in his books or the pictures in his sketchpad. It was a place full of rules that no one had taught him but that his parents knew by heart. Rules that said you could be in the right place, at the right time, doing the right thing, and still, it wouldn't matter. The robin remained unfinished. The morning after the visit from the police, the Carters' home was unusually quiet. Isaiah woke to the faint hum of his mother's voice as she stood at the sink, washing dishes. She wasn't singing like she usually did, it was more of a murmur. A low and steady rhythm that filled the room with tension rather than comfort. Thomas had already left for work, and the air still held the faint scent of his cigarettes. Isaiah knew better than to ask about what had happened the night before. Questions had a way of opening wounds, and his parents were careful about keeping those wounds hidden, even from him. The day stretched long and heavy. Isaiah rode his bike to the park, hoping to lose himself in the simple joy of being a kid. But as he skidded to a stop near the basketball court, he saw the familiar divide. The court was split, not by fences or signs, but by an unspoken rule. On one side, a group of black kids played, their laughter rising above the bounce of the ball. On the other, a handful of white boys leaned against their bikes, watching but not joining in. Isaiah parked his bike and walked toward the court. He wasn't new to this dynamic, but today it felt heavier, sharper. As he dribbled the ball, one of the white boys, tall and wiry with a mop of sandy hair, called out, "Hey, Carter, think you can play with the big boys?" Isaiah froze. His eyes darted to the group of black kids, who had also stopped to watch. He felt the weight of their stares and the silent expectation in the air. The boy who had called out smirked, his friends snickering behind him. "I can play," Isaiah said, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy raised an eyebrow. "Then prove it." Isaiah hesitated, glancing back at his friends on the other side of the court. One of them, Malik, shook his head subtly, mouthing, "Don't." But Isaiah felt something stir inside him, a mix of defiance and desperation. He wasn't sure if it was about the basketball game or the memory of his father standing under the street lamp. His hands open and empty. Whatever it was, it pushed him forward. "All right," Isaiah said, stepping onto the court. The game began, and it wasn't long before the tension turned physical. The wiry boy played rough, shoving and elbowing Isaiah whenever he got the chance. The other white boys laughed, egging him on. Isaiah tried to hold his ground, but every time he made a move, it was met with a new level of aggression. His friends on the sidelines grew quiet, their earlier laughter replaced with unease. The final blow came when Isaiah stole the ball and made a clean shot, the ball swishing through the net with a satisfying sound. But before he could turn to celebrate, the wiry boy shoved him hard, sending him sprawling to the asphalt. "Stay in your place, Carter," the boy sneered, standing over him. Isaiah's cheeks burned as he scrambled to his feet. His palms stung from where they'd scraped the ground, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. He wanted to yell, to push back, but he knew it wouldn't end well. So he grabbed his ball and walked off the court, his head held high even as his vision blurred with tears. Malik caught up to him as he reached his bike. "Man, why do you even play with them?" he asked, his voice low. "You know how they are." Isaiah didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, and his chest ached with a mix of anger and shame. By the time he got home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Ruth was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew. She glanced up as Isaiah walked in, her brow furrowing at the sight of his scraped hands. "What happened?" she asked, setting the spoon down and crossing the room to inspect him. "Nothing," Isaiah muttered, pulling away. "Isaiah," Ruth said, her voice soft but firm. "Talk to me." He hesitated, then blurted out, "Why do they hate us?" Ruth froze, her hands hovering in midair. For a moment, the only sound was the bubbling of the stew. Finally, she sighed and sat down at the table, gesturing for Isaiah to join her. They don't hate us, Isaiah, she said carefully. Not all of them, anyway. But there are people in this world who think they're better than others just because of the color of their skin. It's wrong, but it's how some folks are raised. Why don't we do something about it? Isaiah asked, his voice rising with frustration. Why don't we fight back? Ruth's face softened, but her eyes were heavy with sadness. We do fight back, baby. Every day we fight back by living our lives, by loving each other, by refusing to let their hate define us. But it's not always about winning a battle. Sometimes it's about surviving long enough to see the world change. Isaiah stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He thought about the basketball game, about the divide on the court, about the way the officers had looked at his father. He didn't want to just survive. He wanted to live in a world where those lines didn't exist. That night, as he lay in bed, he made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to make things different. He was going to finish the robin he'd left unfinished, its wings ready to take flight. Isaiah wasn't sure how it began, but the whispers were everywhere by the end of the week. The Robinson family on Elm Street had packed up and left overnight. Their house, once filled with the lively chatter of children and the warm scent of Sunday dinners, now sat dark and lifeless. People said they'd moved south, though the details were vague. Some said it was because Mr. Robinson had lost his job, but others murmured about a dispute with their landlord. Isaiah overheard his parents talking late one night, their voices hushed and tense. It's happening more and more, Ruth said. First the Johnsons, then the Lees, now the Robinsons. How long before it's us? Thomas sighed heavily. They're trying to make this neighborhood theirs. Quietly, but surely. If we fight too loud, we give them an excuse. Isaiah pretended to be asleep, but his heart raced. It felt like the walls of their world were closing in, the cracks in the facade of normalcy growing wider every day. At school, the tension was no less suffocating. Mrs. Calloway, their teacher, had always prided herself on running a tight ship, but even she couldn't keep the undercurrents of animosity from surfacing. It started small. Becky Andrews refused to share her crayons with Malik, claiming they were hers only. When Malik argued back, Becky's parents sent a note to the principal, accusing him of being aggressive. The next day, Mrs. Calloway made a point of reminding the class about the importance of being kind and respectful. But it wasn't kindness or respect that the other students learned from the incident. It was the art of exclusion. Isaiah noticed the shift immediately. Group projects became battles of loyalty. Lunch tables turned into fortresses. And playground games were shadowed by unspoken rules. It wasn't just about who was chosen first or last. It was about who belonged and who didn't. One afternoon, as Isaiah sat alone under the big oak tree, sketching in his notebook, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Mrs. Calloway standing there, her expression tight. Isaiah, can I have a word with you? She asked. He nodded, closing his notebook and following her to the edge of the playground. Is everything all right? She asked, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. Her tone was gentle, but there was something rehearsed about it, like she'd been practicing this conversation all day. Yes, ma'am, Isaiah said, though he wasn't sure it was true. Mrs. Calloway sighed. I've noticed you've been keeping to yourself a lot lately. And, well, some of the other kids' parents have expressed concerns. Isaiah's stomach tightened. Concerns about what? She hesitated, then said, about how you and a few other students are getting along. I just want to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings. The word misunderstandings hung in the air like a bad smell. Isaiah wanted to tell her about the looks, the whispered insults, the way Becky had stared at him with triumph when he was forced to sit alone. But he knew it wouldn't matter. I'm fine, he said instead, his voice flat. Mrs. Calloway gave him a strained smile. Good, let me know if you ever need to talk. All right? He nodded, watching as she walked away. He wasn't angry at her. Not exactly. It wasn't her fault that the rules of the world didn't fit neatly into her lesson plans. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a part in the same system that had pushed the Robinsons out and made Malik the villain in Becky's story. That evening, as Isaiah helped his mother fold laundry, she asked, "How was school today?" "Fine," he said, though his tone betrayed him. Ruth paused, a pair of socks in her hand. "Isaiah," she said softly, "what's on your mind?" He hesitated, then blurted out, "Why do they treat us like we're less? Even when we haven't done anything wrong?" Ruth sat down beside him, her face thoughtful. "Because, baby, they've been told a story their whole lives. A story that says people like us are dangerous or less deserving. And when they see us, they don't see us. They see that story. But stories aren't real," Isaiah argued. "They're just words. They're just words." Ruth agreed. "But words have power. The wrong story, told enough times, can shape the world. That's why we have to keep telling our own stories." Isaiah thought about that as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the stories Mrs. Calloway told, about kindness and respect. He thought about the stories Becky Andrews's parents told about Malik. He thought about the stories the police told about people like his dad. And he realized that every story, no matter how powerful, could be rewritten. The morning Isaiah walked into the grocery store with his father, he sensed something was off. The usual hum of the neighborhood market, the clatter of carts, the chatter of neighbors, felt subdued, almost suffocating. Thomas didn't seem to notice. He nodded politely to the cashier, a wiry man named Carl, who barely glanced up from his register. Isaiah trailed behind as Thomas maneuvered through the aisles, carefully selecting items: a bag of rice, cans of beans, fresh greens. But when they turned into the bread aisle, a voice stopped them cold. "Thomas." It was Mr. Willoughby, the store manager, a portly man with a face that was perpetually red. He stood at the end of the aisle, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Morning, Mr. Willoughby," Thomas said, his tone even but wary. "Morning," Willoughby replied, his voice sharp. "I need to talk to you. In my office." Isaiah felt a chill run through him. Thomas glanced down at him and then back at Willoughby. "Is there a problem?" "Just come with me," Willoughby said, his eyes flicking to Isaiah. "Leave the boy here." Thomas hesitated, then knelt down to Isaiah's level. "Stay here, son. Don't move." Isaiah nodded, watching as his father followed Willoughby down the aisle and through a door marked "Employees Only." The sound of the door closing echoed in the otherwise quiet store. Isaiah wandered the aisle, pretending to look at the shelves but straining to hear any sounds from the back room. After what felt like forever, the door swung open, and Thomas emerged, his face a mask of controlled anger. Without a word, he took Isaiah's hand and led him to the checkout line. "What happened?" Isaiah whispered. "Not now," Thomas replied. At the register, Carl scanned their items with an exaggerated slowness, as though daring them to complain. When Thomas handed him a $20 bill, Carl held it up to the light, inspecting it for longer than necessary. Isaiah felt the weight of the states from other shoppers. He looked up at his father, who stood tall, his expression unyielding. When the change was finally handed over, Thomas grabbed the bag of groceries and walked out without a word. Back in the car, Isaiah couldn't hold back any longer. "Dad, what happened?" Thomas exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. "Willoughby accused me of stealing. Said one of his employees claimed they saw me take something last week." "What?" Isaiah's voice was incredulous. "But you didn't." Quote, "Of course I didn't," Thomas interrupted, "but that doesn't matter to them. All they need is suspicion. And that's enough." "Did they call the police?" Isaiah asked, his voice trembling. Thomas shook his head. "No. Willoughby said he didn't want to make it a big deal. Just wanted to give me a warning." "A warning for something you didn't do?" "That's the way it works." "Isaiah," Thomas said quietly, "they don't need proof when it's people like us." That evening, the conversation at the dinner table was heavy with tension. Ruth listened intently as Thomas recounted the incident. Her jaw tightened with every word. "They've been looking for an excuse," she said. "They don't want us shopping there. This is how they push us out. Slowly, quietly, so no one notices. We're not going anywhere," Thomas said firmly. "They don't get to decide where we belong." But Ruth's expression remained troubled. "What happens when they do call the police? What happens when suspicion turns into something worse?" Isaiah listened silently, the weight of his parents' fear settling heavily on his chest. He thought about the Robinsons, the Lees, and how quickly they had disappeared. Was this how it started for them too? A week later, Isaiah experienced the line for himself. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and the air buzzed with the sounds of the neighborhood, distant car engines, the laughter of children playing, the bark of a dog. Isaiah was playing basketball with his friends Malik and Aaron when they heard the sound of sirens. Two police cars pulled up to the curb, and officers stepped out, their faces unreadable. They approached the boys slowly, their hands resting on their belts. "What's going on here?" one officer asked. "We're just playing," Malik said, his voice cautious. The officer's eyes flicked to the basketball. "We got a report about some kids causing trouble in the area. Breaking windows, vandalizing cars. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "No, sir," Aaron said quickly. "We've been here the whole time." The officer's gaze lingered on Malik. Then Isaiah. "You got any ID?" Isaiah blinked, confused. "We're just kids. Don't get smart with me." The officer snapped. "Answer the question." "We don't have ID," Malik said, his voice low. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "All right, we're going to need you to come with us." "For what?" Isaiah blurted out. "We didn't do anything." "Isaiah," Malik hissed, his voice warning. The officer stepped closer, towering over Isaiah. "Is that attitude I hear? You want to spend the day down at the station?" Isaiah's heart pounded. His friend's eyes were wide with fear, their usual bravado replaced by a silent plea for him to stay quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the officer sighed and stepped back. "Go home," he said, "and stay out of trouble." The boys didn't wait to be told twice. They grabbed their basketball and ran, not stopping until they were blocks away. That night, Isaiah couldn't shake the encounter. The officer's tone, the way he looked at them. It was the same as Carl's in the grocery store. The same as Becky's parents at school. "It's not fair," Isaiah said to his parents after recounting what had happened. "We didn't do anything wrong." "No, it's not fair," Ruth said, her voice heavy with sadness. "But fairness isn't something we can expect." "Isaiah, not from them. So what do we do?" Isaiah asked, his voice breaking. "Just let them treat us like this?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "We stand tall. We know who we are. And we don't let their stories define us." But as Isaiah lay awake that night, he couldn't help but wonder, how long could they stand before the weight became too much? Isaiah couldn't shake the memory of the police officers towering over him and his friends. Their suspicion like a shadow that refused to fade. In the days that followed, his world felt smaller, the boundaries closing in. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way shopkeepers watched him as he wandered aisles. The subtle way adults on the street stepped aside but avoided meeting his eyes. It was as though he'd been marked, not by anything he'd done, but by what he represented. One Friday evening, Thomas announced they were attending a town hall meeting. Isaiah's first instinct was to groan. Town halls were for grown-ups. Long stretches of talking with little to show for it. But Thomas's expression brooked no argument. "This isn't just about us," Thomas explained as they prepared to leave. "It's about showing them that we're here, that we belong in this community." When they arrived at the community center, the room was already buzzing. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, neighbors talking in low murmurs. Isaiah spotted a few familiar faces, but most of the people there were older, their postures rigid with years of standing guard against unseen threats. At the front of the room, a man in a dark suit adjusted his tie and tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Councilman Jameson. Thank you for coming out tonight." Jameson launched into a rehearsed speech about public safety and community initiatives. But the energy in the room shifted when he mentioned recent incidents. The term was vague, but everyone understood. Vandalism, petty theft, the blame that always seemed to fall on the same group of people. Whether deserved or not. "Let's open the floor," Jameson said, gesturing to the crowd. "We want to hear from you." The first speaker was a woman Isaiah recognized as Mrs. Appleton, the owner of the bakery on Main Street. She clutched the microphone like a lifeline, her voice trembling. "I don't feel safe anymore," she began. "My store was broken into last month. I've lived here 30 years. And I've never seen it like this. We need more patrols, more accountability." As murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, Isaiah noticed his father's jaw tighten. When the microphone passed to a tall man in a plaid shirt, he spoke more directly. "We all know what's happening," the man said, his voice hard. "This isn't random. We've got new people moving in. People who don't respect the way things are done around here. Maybe they're not the kind of people we need in this town." The tension in the room thickened. Isaiah felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, a gentle but firm reminder to stay quiet. Thomas, however, sat forward, his eyes locked on the man in plaid. When the microphone reached him, Thomas rose to his feet. My name is Thomas Bennett, he began, his voice calm but commanding. I've lived here for 10 years with my wife and son. We work hard, just like you. We care about this community, just like you. But let me tell you something. What's happening here isn't about safety. It's about fear. Fear of change. Fear of difference. A murmur of discontent rolled through the room. But Thomas pressed on. You talk about respect. But respect is a two-way street. How many times have people like me been stopped, questioned, accused without cause? How many times have we been made to feel like we don't belong? You're missing the point, someone shouted from the back. We're talking about crime, not feelings. Thomas turned toward the voice. Are you sure about that? Or are you just dressing up your prejudice as concern? The room erupted, some people clapping, others shouting in protest. Isaiah's heart pounded as he watched his father stand tall against the tide of anger and denial. Later that night, as they walked home, the air between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Isaiah finally broke the silence. Do you think they even heard you? Thomas sighed. Some of them did. Others? They don't want to hear it. They're too comfortable with their version of the world. So what's the point? Isaiah asked, frustration seeping into his voice. If nothing changes? Thomas stopped and looked at him. His expression resolute. The point is to keep trying. To make them uncomfortable. Because discomfort forces people to think. Even if they don't want to. The tipping point came the following week. Isaiah was walking home from school when he saw a group of kids gathered near the park. At the center of the group was Malik, his friend from the basketball court. What's going on? Isaiah asked, approaching cautiously. They're saying Malik stole something from Mrs. Appleton's bakery. One of the kids replied, their voice low. I didn't take anything. Malik shouted, his voice shaking. I swear. 2 police officers stood nearby, their presence heavy and oppressive. One of them held a notepad, jotting something down. Isaiah felt his chest tighten. He knew Malik wasn't a thief. They had been in class together all day. But he also knew that protests wouldn't matter. The officers had already decided. Without thinking, Isaiah stepped forward. Malik was with me all day, he said, his voice steady. One of the officers looked up. And who are you? His friend. Isaiah replied, we were working on a project for school. He didn't do anything. The officer's gaze was cold. Skeptical. Is that so? Yes. Isaiah insisted. Check with our teacher if you don't believe me. There was a long pause. The kind that stretched and cracked under its own weight. Finally, the officer folded his notepad. We'll follow up, he said, his tone dismissive. As they walked away, Malik turned to Isaiah, his face pale. Why did you do that? Because it was the truth, Isaiah said simply. That night, as Isaiah recounted the story to his parents, Ruth shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. You're brave, Isaiah, but you have to be careful. They don't need much to turn the world against you. Isaiah looked at his father, who nodded solemnly. Your mother's right, but you also did something important today. You showed them you wouldn't back down. Isaiah thought of the crowd at the town hall, of the kids at the park, of Malik's trembling voice. The lines in his world were becoming clearer every day, but so was his determination to cross them. Isaiah sat at the kitchen table, his math textbook open but untouched. The numbers blurred on the page as his mind wandered, replaying the events of the past week. The town hall, the scene at the park, Malik's pale face as the officers left. Every moment felt like another brick added to the weight he carried. And though he tried to shrug it off, it clung to him like a shadow. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. The aroma of Ruth's pot roast filling the room. But the usual warmth of their meals felt distant, as if a thin veil of unease had settled over the house. You've been quiet, Ruth said, her voice soft but probing. What's on your mind, Isaiah? He hesitated, pushing his peas around with his fork. Just, everything, I guess. Thomas leaned forward, his gaze steady. It's not easy, is it? Seeing how the world really works. Isaiah shook his head. It's like, even when nothing's happening, it feels like something is. Like people are just waiting for us to mess up. Ruth reached across the table, placing her hand over his. It's not fair, sweetheart, and it shouldn't be that way. But it is. Thomas nodded, his face etched with a mix of sadness and resolve. The question isn't whether it's fair. It's what you're going to do about it. The next day, Isaiah walked to school with Malik. The usual chatter of classmates seemed louder, the sidelong glances sharper. Malik kept his head down, His usual energy dimmed to a flicker. "They think I did it," Malik said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Even though the cops didn't arrest me. They think I'm a thief." Isaiah didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell Malik that it didn't matter, that people would forget, but he knew it wasn't true. The suspicion would linger, carving its way into Malik's life like an invisible scar. When they reached school, the whispers began almost immediately. Isaiah caught snippets as they passed. "That's the kid who, and I heard he stole." It wasn't just students. Teachers' gazes lingered a moment too long. Their smiles strained. By lunchtime, Malik had had enough. He stood in the middle of the cafeteria, his voice shaking but loud. "I didn't do anything. Why won't anyone believe me?" The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Isaiah's stomach knotted as he watched his friend's outburst met with nothing but awkward glances and mumbled excuses. Malik stormed out, leaving his tray untouched. Isaiah found him in the library, sitting in the far corner with his head in his hands. He sat down beside him, the quiet hum of the room amplifying the weight of their conversation. "They'll get over it," Isaiah said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Will they?" Malik asked, his voice raw. "Or is this just how it is?" Isaiah didn't have an answer. He thought of his father's words. "What are you going to do about it?" and felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. The following weekend, Thomas decided they needed a break from the heaviness that seemed to follow them. He packed a picnic, and the family drove to a nearby park, a wide expanse of green where children played and laughter filled the air. For a while, it worked. Isaiah and Ruth tossed a frisbee while Thomas grilled hot dogs. The tension eased, replaced by the kind of simple joy that felt like a distant memory. But even here, the world had its reminders. A group of boys played basketball nearby, their cheers echoing across the park. One of them called out, "Hey, you two want to play?" Isaiah hesitated. Ruth shot Thomas a look, but he nodded. "Go on," he said, "show him what you've got." Isaiah and Thomas joined the game, quickly finding their rhythm. Isaiah's jump shots drew cheers, and Thomas's defense earned nods of approval. For a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. Then came the comment. One of the boys, a lanky teenager with a sharp voice, muttered as Thomas blocked his shot. "Man, no wonder you're good. Y'all probably play ball all day where you live." Thomas froze, the ball rolling to a stop at his feet. The words were casual, almost careless, but they cut deeper than any shout or insult. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas asked, his tone calm but razor-edged. The boy shrugged, his bravado faltering. "Nothing, just, you know." "No, I don't know," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Why don't you explain it?" The other boys fell silent, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and unease. The game was over. As they packed up to leave, Ruth broke the silence. "You handled that well." Thomas shook his head. "It shouldn't need handling, but people will always find ways to remind you of where they think you belong." Isaiah sat quietly in the backseat, staring out the window. The park had been a temporary escape, but even there, the weight of who they were followed them. He thought of Malik, of the whispers at school, of the way Thomas had stood his ground. The lines were clearer than ever. As they pulled into the driveway, Thomas turned to Isaiah. "You asked me once if people heard me, if what I said mattered." Isaiah nodded, unsure where this was going. "I can't promise they always do." Thomas continued, "But the alternative, staying silent, guarantees they won't." Isaiah felt the words settle deep in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to speak yet, but he knew he was listening. It was a Monday morning when Isaiah's world tilted again. He walked into history class to find the teacher, Mr. Pearson, scribbling, "Civil Rights and Its Legacy," on the board. Isaiah slid into his seat as the chatter around him grew louder. "Today," Mr. Pearson began, "we're going to discuss the civil rights movement and its impact on modern society. I'd like to start with a question. Has the movement achieved its goals? Why or why not?" A girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. "I think it's mostly done. I mean, we're all equal now, right? We can go to the same schools, eat at the same restaurants. What else is there?" Isaiah flinched at her words. He glanced at Malik, who sat a few rows away, staring intently at his desk. The teacher nodded thoughtfully. "That's one perspective," Mr. Pearson said, turning to the rest of the class. "Does anyone have another?" The silence that followed was deafening. Isaiah felt the weight of expectation. the way it seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on him and Malik like a spotlight they hadn't asked for. At lunch, the tension lingered. Isaiah and Malik sat at their usual table, picking at their food while the conversation from history class replayed in their minds. "You should have said something," Malik said suddenly, his voice low but firm. "Like what?" Isaiah asked, though he already knew the answer. "Like the truth," Malik snapped. "That it's not over. That just because we're not sitting in the back of the bus doesn't mean everything's fine." Isaiah looked down at his tray, guilt twisting in his stomach. He wanted to explain, to say that it wasn't that simple, but the words stuck in his throat. Malik shook his head and stood, leaving Isaiah alone with his silence. That evening, Isaiah found his father in the garage, tinkering with the old radio he'd been trying to fix for weeks. The soft hum of static filled the air as Thomas adjusted the dials. "Hey, Dad," Isaiah said, leaning against the workbench. Thomas glanced up, a smudge of grease on his cheek. "What's on your mind, son?" Isaiah hesitated. "Why is it so hard to speak up? In school today, we talked about civil rights. And I didn't say anything. Malik thinks I should've." Thomas set down his tools and turned to face him. "It's hard because it costs something. Speaking up makes you visible. It makes people uncomfortable. And sometimes, it makes them angry." Isaiah nodded, the truth of his father's words settling over him. "So what do?" Thomas sighed. "You decide if what you have to say is worth the cost. And if it is, you speak, even when it's hard." The next day, Mr. Pearson continued the discussion, this time focusing on systemic racism. "Can anyone give an example of how inequality still exists today?" he asked. The class was silent again, and Isaiah felt the familiar weight pressing down on him. He thought of Malik's words, of his father's advice. His heart pounded as he raised his hand. "Isaiah?" Mr. Pearson said, surprised. Isaiah took a deep breath. "I think inequality still exists in a lot of ways. Like how some people are treated differently by the police. Or how schools in certain neighborhoods don't have the same resources as others." The room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Then a boy in the back scoffed. "Come on, that's not true. If you work hard, you can succeed no matter where you're from." Isaiah's hands clenched into fists under the desk. "It's not about working hard," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering inside him. "It's about the system making it harder for some people to even get the chance to succeed." Mr. Pearson stepped in before the argument could escalate. "Thank you for sharing, Isaiah. These are important perspectives to consider." But as class ended, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, the weight of being seen. By the time he got home, Isaiah was exhausted. He sank into the couch, his head throbbing with the effort it had taken to speak up. Ruth sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "I heard about what you said in class," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Isaiah nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Malik, of the way their friendship had shifted under the strain of unspoken expectations. He thought of the girl in the front row, so confident in her ignorance, and the boy in the back, so quick to dismiss his reality. "Do you think it made a difference?" he asked. Ruth smiled, though her eyes were heavy with knowing. "Sometimes, making a difference starts with just being brave enough to say what needs to be said." Isaiah didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought of all the ways the world demanded silence, and how each act of speaking up chipped away at that demand. He wasn't sure he was ready for the cost, but he knew one thing: it was worth it. Isaiah woke up to the sound of raised voices outside. He rushed to the window, his heart sinking at the sight of a small crowd gathering in front of the school across the street. Signs bobbed in the air, their messages stark and unmistakable: "Protect our community," "No CRT indoctrination," and "Keep politics out of schools." He ran to the kitchen where his mother was already pouring coffee. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't need to look to know what was happening. "They've been out there since sunrise," Ruth said, her voice low but steady. "They're upset about the new curriculum." Isaiah frowned. He had heard about the school board's decision to include more Black history and discussions of systemic inequality in classes. To him, it seemed overdue, but to others, it was an act of war. Thomas walked in, his face lined with worry. "Are you going to school today?" he asked. Isaiah hesitated, but then nodded. "I have to." Thomas sighed and put a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful." The crowd was still there when Isaiah arrived at school, their chants loud and pointed. He walked quickly, keeping his head down, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Inside, the halls buzzed with nervous energy. In history class, Mr. Pearson looked visibly shaken as he addressed the room. Today, we'll continue our discussion on civil rights and the importance of understanding history, he said, his voice firmer than usual. No matter what happens outside, this classroom is a place for learning and respect. Isaiah noticed Malik shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He wanted to say something to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come. At lunch, Isaiah and Malik sat in their usual spot, but the atmosphere was different. They could hear whispers from nearby tables, feel the weight of eyes on them. Why are they so scared of the truth? Malik muttered, his frustration barely contained. Because the truth threatens their version of the world, Isaiah said quietly. If they admit it, they'd have to change. Malik looked at him, his expression a mixture of anger and admiration. You sound like your dad. Isaiah managed a small smile. He's been through it all before. Maybe he's right about the cost. After school, Isaiah decided to walk home, needing time to think. As he passed the protesters, a man shouted, "Hey, kid, you think you're oppressed or something?" Isaiah froze, his fists clenching. He turned to see the man glaring at him, his face red with indignation. For a moment, Isaiah considered walking away, but something in him snapped. "I think you're scared," Isaiah said, his voice trembling but strong. "Scared that learning the truth might make you see yourself differently." The man opened his mouth to retort, but Isaiah was already walking away. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and exhilaration mixing in equal measure. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. Isaiah recounted what had happened, his parents listening intently. When he finished, Ruth reached across the table and took his hand. "You did the right thing," she said, "but it's not going to get easier." Thomas nodded. "Standing up is only the first step. The real challenge is staying upright when the world tries to knock you down." Isaiah thought about those words as he lay in bed that night. He realized that the struggle wasn't just about what happened in the classroom or on the streets. It was about the constant battle to hold on to hope in the face of despair. In the weeks that followed, the protests grew louder, but so did the voices of those who supported the curriculum. Students, parents, and teachers held a counter-protest, their signs reading, "Teach the truth," and "History matters." Isaiah and Malik joined, their voices blending with the chorus of chants that echoed through the town. The tension didn't disappear overnight. Some neighbors stopped speaking to the Thompsons, while others expressed quiet support. But through it all, Isaiah felt a growing sense of purpose. He realized that the fight wasn't just for himself or his friends. It was for everyone who came after them. Months later, the school board held a meeting to decide the fate of the new curriculum. The room was packed, emotions running high. Isaiah's heart raced as he stood at the podium, his prepared speech trembling in his hands. "I'm not here to argue or fight," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm here to ask for a chance to learn. History isn't just dates and facts. It's stories. Stories that teach us who we are and who we can be. If we ignore the hard parts, we're not telling the whole story." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Not everyone was convinced, but Isaiah saw hope in the faces of those who were. The curriculum passed, and Isaiah felt a quiet victory. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. As he sat in his room that night, writing in his journal, he thought about the lessons his father had taught him and the courage he'd found within himself. The fight for justice was far from over, but Isaiah understood now that every voice mattered. The rhythm of resistance wasn't always loud. It was the steady beat of hearts refusing to stay silent. And in that rhythm, Isaiah found his place.